In today's show, we're talking about the release of the new Sony A1 Mark II. Hey everyone, welcome into Magnolia Photography SC. I'm Jeff House and I'm a wildlife photographer in Charleston, South Carolina. And if you're just joining me, you'll notice I have a pretty heavy jacket on right now, and it's hard to believe, but it is freezing here in Charleston, South Carolina. Feels like winter here. We are in the 50s, and I know for a lot of people out there, that is not cold, but it is about 15 to 20 degrees colder than normal right now here in Charleston, and we are feeling it. The mornings are down in the 30s and the 40s, and we are looking for our warm weather. Have to wait a few more months. Hey, anyway, talking about the Sony A1 Mark II, that was released back on the 19th of November. Sony had a release presentation of this camera, and so it has answered a lot of questions for everyone right now, because there was a lot of speculation about this camera and when it would be released, and of course what features it would have. We actually talked about this camera on a previous video. I was sharing with you that I photograph wildlife with the Sony A1, and it was talked about the Sony A2 coming out, and I decided not to wait for the camera. When I was considering my purchase, I was originally shooting with the Sony A7R5, which is a very capable camera for wildlife photography, but it only really shoots about 8 to 10 frames per second. And I really wanted something that was in that 30 frames per second, and the Sony A1 is able to fulfill that. Now, the Sony A2, or I should say A1 Mark II, when we were looking at this camera and really in the complete speculation phase, there were a lot of things flying around, when it was going to be released. They were talking about early in 2025. Some sources were saying it was going to be later in 2025. There was a lot of speculation that maybe they would take the 50 megapixel sensor and up the megapixels on that sensor to maybe something similar to the Sony A7R5, which is a 61 megapixel sensor. There's also speculation that they would go to 60 frames per second, maybe see some better autofocusing, and maybe see some other features. But that was, again, all speculation. And now the camera is out, and there are some people that are very happy with the new camera, and there are some people that are very disappointed because there was nothing about the camera that is revolutionary like it was when it was announced as the Sony A1 back in January of 2021. The Sony A1 came out with a 50 megapixel sensor, and you could shoot 30 frames per second in a RAW file format. That was pretty revolutionary. There's nothing like that with the Sony A1 Mark II. So there's really a few, what I would call big changes to the camera that you really need to decide what you want to do with it, right? What is it worth to you for this camera? Or should you just go buy the Sony A1 that I'm using? They dropped the price $1,000 on that camera. It's now down to $5,400. I think that makes that camera right now a very compelling option for those of you in wildlife photography. Interestingly enough, the new Sony A1 Mark II, it was rumored that that camera might come out somewhere between $6,900 to $7,400. They were talking maybe $1,000 above its the retail price of the Sony A1, which of course was $6,400. So the new Sony A1 Mark II is listed at $6,400, just like the original A1. So that was pretty surprising news right there. And then again, they dropped the regular Sony A1 down to $54. So you got to decide what is worth it to you, and are the the changes in the A1 Mark II worth that extra $1,000? And I'm kind of curious if it really is. In fact, my wife asked me, are you kind of regretting that you didn't wait for the Mark II version? And, after looking at everything, right now, I can't say that I am. I'm pretty happy with my decision to go with the Sony A1. Now, I paid $6,400 for it. Unfortunately, I've had it long enough where there's no price protection. I contacted the retailer that I bought it from, and I'm outside of 30 days, so they can't honor the $5,400 price, which kind of stinks because I'm really not that far outside of the 30-day window. But I guess that is what it is. I just kind of got to deal with it. Let's talk about some of the features that I think are the most relevant on the Sony A1 Mark II. The first thing that it has is the flippy screen, right? So the original A1, you could pull it out from the back, you could tilt it up or down, but you couldn't flip it and do all sorts of different things, right? This has got multiple axes. You can flip it into a portrait mode, horizontal mode. You can turn it to film yourself, and you can do all those wonderful things. For me, personally, I'm not really filming myself that often. I really don't need that feature. What I do in wildlife photography, the Sony A1 flip screen really does the job for me. I really don't need anything more. So yeah, it's a nice feature when you need it, but I don't find that I need it. Matter of fact, since I've had the A1, I've never been in a situation where I wished I had the additional axes on the flip screen. So for me, that's not a big deal. For you, that may be something different. You may film yourself a lot, and that could come in handy. But for me, not a big deal. The other thing that it has is some changes to its autofocus. And they're saying that the autofocus is improved over the Sony A1. And now they do offer different things like autofocus for, recognition of humans and animals and birds and trains and planes and all of those types of things. Well, I have that on my Sony A7R5 camera. I can tell you that I used humans, I used birds, and maybe some animals if I was photographing some alligators, but quite honestly, I could leave it on bird and it would do just fine when photographing alligators as well. Again, that's another change to the camera. Yeah, it's nice to have, but does it really benefit you as a photographer and what you photograph? For me, it doesn't. That's not a big change for me. That's not a big deal. The other thing that it has is pre-capture. Now, the one thing that I will say about the pre-capture is I have not personally used this technology on any camera. But I hear so many YouTubers out there saying having a camera with pre-capture has changed the way they photograph wildlife. My question is this: pre-capture essentially is a setting that you can have in the camera. And with the Sony A1 Mark II, I believe you can set it anywhere from 0.2 or 0.3 seconds all the way up to 1 second. Meaning, if we're looking at a camera that's 30 frames per second, let's just say we set it for 1 second. When you depress the shutter button halfway down, right, to focus, the camera is going to take pictures for the amount of time that you set it. So if we set it for 1 second and we get those 30 frames per second, that's what the camera is going to do. And then we will fully depress the shutter and we will start taking pictures like normal. Now, if I'm understanding the way pre-capture works exactly, again, maybe using it in real life would change my opinion or change my belief on this. But to me, it seems like you've got to be just as lucky with pre-capture as you are as depressing the shutter button to take a picture, right? So the theory is if you have a bird or an animal sitting there and you can, are kind of anticipating the bird maybe flying from the perch, especially those smaller, really fast birds, by using pre-capture, you're able to capture that bird's flight off of that branch much easier than if you were using just straight pictures with the shutter. I have a hard time wrapping my head around this, right? Because if you depress the shutter halfway and the camera starts its pre-capture and it starts capturing images in the camera for you, don't you have to be just as lucky to get that bird leaving the perch as you do as if you were pressing the shutter button? It would seem to me that it all comes down to a little bit of a matter of luck. And of course, you got to understand when the bird is going to likely leave its perch, right? It doesn't always happen that way, though. There are many times when I expect a bird to leave its perch and I'm taking pictures continuously and I don't get the shot because the bird doesn't do what I'm expecting it to do. And then maybe I stop for a second, then Murphy's Law, the bird takes off. Well, I see this being the same issue with pre-capture. If you're depressing the shutter halfway and your camera's pre-capturing that moment, well, if the bird doesn't take off during that time, well, then you still miss the shot. So I would like to, again, see this firsthand for myself to see if it does really make a difference. But I feel either way still involves a certain amount of luck. If you've used pre-capture and you have experience with it, let me know. I have not used, again, that technology to date. So for me, I have a hard time understanding that one until I get my hands on it and fully use it in my real world scenarios. Let's talk about focusing though with the A1, right? We're talking a lot about this pre-capture. We're talking a lot about focusing and having these different methods in which to focus using the Sony A1 Mark II. Now, when I bought the Sony A1, there was a firmware update a few months before I got it. I didn't upgrade to the firmware right away, but I recently did it, and I will say the camera focused really well before I did the firmware upgrade. After doing the firmware upgrade, it focuses even better. I do notice a significant increase in the number of photos that I get in focus. Now, I don't want to downplay the focusing capabilities of this camera before the firmware upgrade because, again, it was really, really good. I think it was up there with most cameras on the market today as far as focusing. And after the firmware, I have no issues with focusing. You're not going to hit every shot, I don't think, with any camera that you have, right? No camera is perfect with focusing. They are saying the Sony A2, the Sony A1 Mark II is giving you more in-focus shots than the A1 with all of the firmware upgrades. That's something that you're going to have to see, right? This is all going to be in the real world. It's going to come down to a lot of different things. It's going to come down to your shooting style. Are you using a monopod or a tripod when you photograph? Are you hand holding? These are important things to know. What are your shutter speeds? What kind of photos do you like to create? What style do you shoot in, right? Do you use a slightly slower shutter speed because you like a little motion blur? Do you like to freeze the action so you're using higher shutter speed? There's a lot of things that go into whether or not your pictures are in focus or not. So again, this, for me, I don't see this being a huge deal. Yes, I probably would get some more photos in focus using the Sony A1 Mark II based on everything that I'm seeing right now. But is it worth that price? You know, that's the thing that I'm kind of looking at for those of you who are in the market to buy a camera. Is it worth that price to have a few more photos in focus? I guess you have to answer these questions for yourself of, do you use a support system? What is your shooting style like? And will you benefit? It really might be worth renting this camera from one of those online resources so that you can get a feel firsthand. Maybe rent both cameras. You know, if you're talking about spending $5,400 or $6,400 on a camera, renting it, spending a few $100s to rent it may not be a bad option to protect that investment, right? Kind of future-proof it. Make sure that you're getting the camera that you want. But those are the main upgrades so far that are really being discussed when it comes to the Sony A1 Mark II. We have that pre-capture, we have some different focusing options, and we have the flippy screen there. Are those enough? Are those enough right now if you're in the market to buy a camera to spend $1,000 more than the Sony A1? Now, the Sony A1, we can all agree, is, you know, the camera is 3 years old, right? It's approaching 4 years old this January. So you got to consider, you know, what's it going to be like? I would like to think that Sony will continue to push out firmware updates for its customers who own the Sony A1. They could add pre-capture. They could improve the focusing system just like they did in the Sony A1 Mark II, just with firmware updates. But Sony has often been looked at as a little cheesy when it comes to this end of it, because they don't always push out those firmware updates to their existing customers. You know, as someone who has spent nearly $17,000 in Sony cameras over the past several years, I would like to believe that Sony is going to give this kind of support to their loyal customers. And I really hope they do, because I think they can continue to make the A1 a better camera. And they can continue to put firmware updates out for the Sony A1 Mark II as well, and continue to keep that a little bit ahead of the Sony A1, which gives their customers and gives anyone in the market for a camera a couple of different options at a couple of different price points. Guys, what do you think about this? What are you in the market for this camera? If you were to buy it, which one would you buy? Even if you're not in the market, if you had to buy a camera today, would you spend the $5,400 on the A1, or would you go for the $6,400 price tag and get the newer version, the Sony A1 Mark II? I would love to know your thoughts on this. What do you think about this camera, and what do you think about the changes that they've come out with? Let me know in the comments below. I would appreciate it very much. And if you like this video, please be sure to give it a like, and please be sure to consider subscribing to the channel if you like this video. Other than that, thank you so much for carving out a little time to spend with me today. I appreciate it very much, and I look forward to seeing everyone in my next video. But until then, take care.